It's one woman's foul-mouthed meltdown over a request to wear a mask.
I don't give a
Let's press the reverse button to 2019. There are reports of an illness in central China that starts off with a loss of taste and smell, followed by intense dry coughing, shortness of breath, and then a fever. In the West, many pass this off as just another endemic in a far-off land such as the 2013 outbreak of Ebola. I will admit that I was one of those people at the time who shrugged it off. And in hindsight, I like to tell myself in 2019,
Uh-oh, retard alert! Retard alert, class!
according to most experts, COVID-19 came about from zoonosis, meaning that its origins come from another animal. Get it? Zoo equal animal, gnosis equal disease. Gotta love how the Greek language finds its way into the English language for almost any word that sounds fancy. The most common sub-explanation of this explanation is that the virus came from a wet market in Wuhan, China. This involved bats, which are flying virus factories, also responsible for Ebola, MERS, and a host of other ailments. Some made a more controversial claim that the virus was passed on from a bat to a pangolin. A pangolin is basically an old world armadillo with scales that inspired the Pokemon Sandslash. Was that last piece of information necessary? Absolutely not. I just wanted to mention it anyway. Now, pangolins are one of the most widely trafficked animals, due to them being the only mammal with scales. They're oftentimes used in traditional Chinese medicine as a form of Viagra, even though there's no scientific evidence for this. If the pangolin theory behind COVID is true, then the biggest pandemic in living memory happened because some guys in China couldn't get hard. And of course, there was the lab leak theory, which claims that the virus was the product of human scientific endeavors rather than nature. At first, the theory was popular on the internet but dismissed by mainstream media and much of the scientific community as a supposed crank theory. Around half a year later, the theory gained more traction in mainstream media circles, but it is still a minority opinion among experts. The entire ordeal led to increased skepticism of mainstream institutions, mostly spread on social media. I personally have no stance since I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm just a guy on the internet talking about the history of online social movements. And oh boy, did the COVID pandemic spur internet discussions. Although calling them discussions might be giving them too much credit. By the time the virus had ravaged through China and then clobbered Italy, it became clear that COVID was not an epidemic in a far-off land. It wasn't something that just happened a long ways away in a place where people think the scales of armadillo things are treatments for ED, or that bat wings can be replacements for beef stock. This was a virus here at home. And this virus, and the discourse around it, would dominate all our lives for the next 2 years. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a brief spat of optimism, as many thought the event would put an end to the bitter culture wars of the mid to late 2010s. "We're all in this together" was the slogan. People thought that people would come together in unison to fight a common enemy. Who cares about black, white, American, Indian, Spanish, Chinese, male, female, gay, straight, cis, trans, young, old, when there are strands of RNA wrapped in protein that are coming to kill us all? As Spain and Italy were engulfed with the virus, public health officials across the globe, including the World Health Organization, told everybody to stay at home and engage in what is called social distancing. As much pain and suffering as the virus caused, it was a godsend for neckbeards, Discord mods, and Twitter activists everywhere, as now everyone was forced to act like them, a bunch of terminally online antisocial troglodytes. Most office jobs switched to working online from home instead of the office. No longer would white-collar workers have to engage in small talk at the water cooler. Instead, they engaged in small talk on Zoom and Microsoft Teams. This transition allowed some people to escape the grueling commute times and use that spare time for more productive activities like arguing with people on Facebook about the origins of the virus that led to this conundrum. Social distancing also changed our consumption habits, as people spent more of their disposable income on goods rather than services, and services require coming into contact with people. The consumption of goods also changed, as brick and mortar stores were closed, while online retail, namely Amazon, boomed. Jeff Bezos made tons of money while his workers were angry, and they had been subjected to health hazards at these warehouses. This led to the viral video titled, quote, "Dildos are not an essential item." To be fair to the people who were purchasing these items, with the lack of social contact, including dating, perhaps more people needed some DIY stress relief during the COVID pandemic. The decrease in service sector jobs, particularly in restaurants and bars, led to large-scale unemployment during this period. Some people lost their livelihoods to the point that they ended up in tents, and these were probably the only people who weren't terminally online during the time. Humans are social animals, and the only thing worse than being surrounded by people is being surrounded by no one. Now don't get me wrong, people suck, but some of the worst company you can have is on your own with your own mind. Being alone leads to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and even cardiovascular disease, which is just fantastic when there's a virus spreading which targets your cardiovascular system. Now, while the virus was clearly most deadly towards older people for obvious reasons, Zoomers were not unscathed. Zoomers were already one of the most socially maladjusted, isolated, and terminally online generations we've ever seen. Who needs to go outside when you have Minecraft? Who needs to make friends when you have Instagram followers? And who needs to do boring, lame stuff like having a relationship and having sex when there's X videos a click away? Many people took the social lockdowns as a blessing in disguise. With more free time and isolation, many could learn a new language, or a new musical instrument, try out forging, or underwater basket weaving. But for many a Zoomer, that would be just too constructive and productive. Why waste your time accomplishing something of value when you can spend your time trying to destroy the reputation of someone who has accomplished more than you? Through increased digitalization, the pandemic ended up indirectly exacerbating many of the pre-existing mental health issues Zoomers were dealing with. And keep in mind that this is a generation that uses therapy words like trauma, gaslighting, and other terms that have just become part of the internet's common English vernacular. Now, as easy as it is to forget, some people did actually go outside and get vitamin D, and maybe even touch foliage during the pandemic. You'd think this would assuage the problems related to isolation, but in many ways it exacerbated them. One of the biggest culture war issues at the time, online and offline, was face cloth. Just look how sinister this looks. I'm obviously talking about face masks. In the wealthy, digitalized, conformist countries of East Asia, it is customary to wear masks when you are sick, especially when there's an outbreak. However, in the more individualistic Western world, this became a more divisive issue, resulting in internet flame wars and IRL Karen tier meltdowns. Public health officials didn't help the situation when they recommended not using masks at the beginning of the pandemic due to fears of supply shortages, only to change their minds later on. On top of that, many tapeworms in the form of humans used e-commerce to purchase masks en masse and then sell them at an upcharge. Confusion caused backlash, in which the masks were compared to dog muzzles, face diapers, and even Zyklon B chambers. In reality, the N95 respirator is actually a highly effective tool for preventing respiratory infections. However, cloth masks, while being better than nothing, are not super effective. And yeah, they kind of do look like a facial diaper. Granted, none of this mattered to Facebook uncles whose scientific literacy is on par with that of an African tribesman who dictates the height of which witches can fly at. Many had viewed science as one of the last few institutions that could withstand the decline in public trust. After all, being anti-science is the equivalent of saying, "Me no like fact." The scientific establishment, and in some instances, the scientific method, was now being viewed with more and more suspicion, particularly by people on the right, but this time for secular rather than religious reasons. Science is still an institution, and institutions are composed of people. And remember that the
people are retarded.
One of the more nuanced debates was over lockdowns. This was a debate based on protecting people's livelihoods versus protecting people's lives. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was widespread support for the lockdowns, as we were only expecting it to last a few weeks, or at most, a month or two. As time went on, this led to mass outrage, as stores closed and there was mass unemployment. And you know what unemployed people have the time to do? Be bitter online. Despite all the emphasis on staying at home, there was one area in which much of the medical and cultural establishments made an exception for: protests that were in line with their political beliefs. When the BLM protests erupted after the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer, many of the organizations which told people to stay indoors and scroll through YouTube recommendations were now promoting protesting, calling racism a disease like COVID. The politicization of healthcare and the online discourse around it contributed to growing skepticism of the medical establishment. And skepticism of medicine is not particularly good when you have a microscopic, mutating demon spreading from coof to coof. As strange as it sounds, during the 2000s, anti-vaccine BS was the cause of Hollywood liberals, not mouth-breathing rednecks and trailer park Karens. When the first COVID vaccines were available to the public, those who wanted the vaccines got inoculated en masse. Later on, more skeptical people hopped on board, while others, like Joe Rogan, refused to use livestock deworming medication. Joe Rogan was at this point one of the biggest celebrities on the internet at the time, if not the biggest. The perception around him across the board at the beginning was very, very positive. But as the pandemic moved on, he seemed to slowly morph into a quasi-right-of-center culture war figure due to his comments about the vaccine. Some of this was due to factual inaccuracies he spread, but also part of it had to do with the old media being jealous of the competition coming from online podcasts. But ivermectin was one of the tamer controversies. There was even one case when a couple died because they thought taking chloroquine from aquarium fish medicine would cure their COVID infections. It's rather sad when the most intelligent life form in the household is a goldfish.
People are retarded.
World leaders even made asses of themselves, like the then president of Tanzania, who ordered an end to COVID testing and claimed that Jesus would heal the sick instead.
The people are retarded.
But that's just a country in Africa. That sort of nonsense would never happen in a developed country, right?
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
People are retarded.
One of the biggest anti-vax showdowns was the 2022 Freedom Convoy in Canada's capital, Ottawa, in which a group of truckers refused the government mandates to get vaccinated, even though the government mandates came from the provincial government based in Toronto, not the federal government based in Ottawa. None of this seemed to matter to the IRL truckers or their supporters who dominated social media discourse on the issue during this time. However, an example, 102,435, having a lot of online support does not mean that you will be successful, as the Trudeau government invoked the Emergencies Act, which froze the online bank accounts of many of the protest key figures, leading it to fizzle out. Despite its failures, it did show that Canada, a country which many consider to be immune to the rise of internet organized populism, was indeed not immune, and no vaccine could inoculate them against it. Many compared the medical and political establishment's positive reaction to the BLM protests, which broke COVID protocol, to the negative reaction of the convoy protests. This continued to exacerbate the culture wars, which at this point had become nearly as exhausting as having a respiratory infection. The pandemic would have a few more flashpoints, with Delta, Omicron, etc., but would eventually fizzle out during the spring of 2022. For decades to come, both educated historians and internet mouth breathers will continue to argue over the series of events that plagued the world, both literally and figuratively. A virus that should have united us all in hatred of our common enemy made us hate each other more than ever.